Before the next episode of X Job Downloaded starts, I have a big favour to ask. If you've enjoyed any of our episodes so far, please can you click on the follow button on your platform. I'm on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon and YouTube. It costs nothing to follow, but makes a real difference to me as a podcast producer. Thank you. My name is Paul Maleary, and for 30 years I served with Essex Police. During this time I interviewed suspects for murder, abduction, rape and extortion, plus a variety of other crimes. Now I interview former police and military personnel and anybody else who has an interesting story to tell. Sit back and listen to X Job Downloaded. Ladies and gentlemen, today's interview is with the fantastic Steve Reynolds. Now, Steve has written this book, The Met on Trial. You can find this book on Amazon and the link is within the body of the text. Thank you. This interview is being tape recorded. My name is Paul Maleary and this is X Job Downloaded. And today I'm going to interview Steve Reynolds. Now, Steve was a Detective Chief Superintendent with Essex Police, and when he retired, he went to the IPCC. But his story didn't stop at the IPCC. He's gone on to be a published author and consultant in the private world. But good morning to you, Steve.
Morning, Paul.
Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for your time today. I know we could reminisce for hours because of some of the things we worked on. But where did it all start for Steve Reynolds, and how did you become involved with Essex Police?
Well, it starts really going back to when I was 16. I managed to get into the police cadets. And like everybody else at that time, I did a couple of years residential at Chelmsford. That was really lots and lots of sport, a bit of police studies, and further in your education. We went to Chelmsford College 3.5 days a week. And as I say, the rest of the time was spent doing sport, which I absolutely loved. Because I was almost the youngest in my intake, there was 13 months they had to find me something to do before my 19th birthday. So I did a series of attachments. I worked at a newspaper, Essex Chronicle newspaper for a month. I worked at Whalley Mental Hospital, Orsett Hospital, did an outward bound course, worked at a centre for disabled young adults. And as well as all those activities and attachments, I did a driving course, mustn't forget that. The one and only one I'd had in 31 years service was as a 18-year-old. But I had a number of police attachments. That didn't include CID, but I asked for a CID attachment, and that actually began my love for the CID.
Fantastic.
So that was the cadet side of things. Moving on to being a constable, I went to Eynsham, like most male officers of my era, and eventually got posted to Benfleet and then did Canvey Island. And really by that time, I was able to do CID attachments. So I think at my 2-year probation, I spent at least 3 months, if not more, on CID, and hardly went back to uniform afterwards.
Brilliant. What year did you join the cadets?
I joined the cadets in 1971, and then became a constable in 74. And I was very, very lucky. The promotion system in those days was very, very different. So having joined in 74, in September 74, I was able to take the sergeant's exam almost as soon as I finished my probation.
Wow.
In November 76. Past that, I've done a CID selection course, so all my crime had been sorted out. Traffic and general police duties with the other areas, and I passed those okay. But in those days, very, very fortunately, if you got the results, and I think I got the results round about February 1977, you were then able to be a late entrant in the inspector's exam in April. So I took that exam, and you only had to get 50% pass rate. And also, you only had to answer, I think it was about 5 out of 8 questions.
Right.
So there was many areas, particularly general police duties, that you didn't even have to bother revising. So I took that exam. I found the crime paper okay, the traffic paper okay, but the general police duties was an absolute nightmare. And I looked through the questions that I could answer and attempted those. And then I finished about an hour early, which is never a good sign.
No.
And my pride didn't let me walk out of the room early. So I just sat there and sort of worked out with everything I'd written, if I'd got all the parts of the questions, and many parts I couldn't answer, if I got all the parts that I had answered correct, I worked out I would get 50%. And when the results came out, I had 70-something in crime, 70-something in traffic, and 50 in general police duties. So I scraped a pass, but more importantly, it meant that I was 22 years old, or wasn't even 22, it was before my 22nd birthday, and I was qualified to inspector. I had no intention whatsoever of getting promoted at that time, but it was just great to get those exams behind me. And that was really a big plus and a big help for my career.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask you a question about when you were a cadet. So they taught you to drive, didn't they? They actually physically at that time taught people to drive.
That they did. I mean, it depends. I mean, I'd already passed my driving test, so I did what was then a standard driving, 4-week standard driving course. But people who hadn't passed their test, yes, I think they did sort of start from scratch. But I think in my intake, most people already had their driving licence by the time they did their driving course. Yeah.
So you're now qualified to the rank of inspector. Yeah. Where was your first posting on CID, and where did you go to as a detective sergeant? Right.
So the first posting was Rayleigh CID, which is, I was in the Rayleigh division because Canby was in the Rayleigh division at that time. So I went to Rayleigh division, worked with people like Steve Bright, John Hammond, John Mann. My sergeant was Ken Lingwood, and John Clark was the DI at that stage. And I did about 3 years as a DC. And the thing then was, because I had my exams, after settling in as a DC, opportunities arise to become or to do acting sergeant.
Yeah.
So I took those opportunities and I thought, actually, I quite like this. You know, you sort of get a bit of a selection, bit of a choice of what jobs you're actually going to deal with.
Yep. And
I was quite happy doing that. And I think it was at that stage that I did sort of make the decision that whatever lay ahead, I was going to be a detective. If somebody had said to me as a DC, look, you're going to be promoted, but there's a chance you'll never get back onto the CID, I would have honestly said, well, thanks very much, but I'll stay a DC, because it was the investigating side of things that attracted me. It's that what I wanted to do.
And it's such a good job, though, isn't it? I mean, it is, being a detective is probably, or was, the best job for me in the force.
Definitely. And people wanted to do it. There were some excellent officers who didn't become detectives and did a cracking job in other departments or just staying on patrol work. But there was never a shortage of applicants for CID selection courses. It's what, most people wanted to do. Not everybody could achieve it, but as I say, there was a real attraction of being a detective.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you remember the first sort of crimes that you dealt with at that time?
Yeah, I remember my first day as a DC. I remember a guy called Gary Bodymead, actually, I remember his name, turning up in the front office and wanting to admit a robbery, which was quite unbelievable, really. So it was the ideal job to be given to the new boy, who was me. And, he admitted some other offences, and, I was well on my way. But as I say, I did 3 years there. And then there was a policy within Essex Police that people would get promoted back into uniform. And I accepted that. As I said, I knew if I did that I'd want to get some sort of assurance I'd come back onto CID. But then round about May 1980, there were suddenly 5 DSs vacancies cropped up in the county, and 5 DCs became DSs. And I was one of those lucky people, and I was promoted to detective sergeant and posted to South Ockendon.
Wow.
Now, I didn't even know where South Ockendon was. I'm a South End boy, born and bred. I sort of knew where Grays was, but I had no idea where Ockendon was. So I remember the Sunday before my first day driving there, making sure I knew where the police station was so I didn't turn up late the next day, and then started work there. Again, in those days, your collar number changed, and I became Detective Sergeant 321. At that stage, there was a programme on television with I think a
Ted Rogers
cartoon character doll thing called Dusty Bin.
Yep.
And so that became my nickname in the Greys division to begin with, as Dusty. I had 2 quite mature, let's say, DCs to supervise. That was Roy Rout and Gordon Muir. I was 26 then, and still pretty naive. And I think now if somebody said I was going to supervise those 2, it'd scare the life out of me.
Yeah.
But in those days, being naive, it didn't bother me at all, and we got on great, and it was a very, very enjoyable time in my service.
And it's a real salt of the earth place to work, isn't it, Ockendon and all around there? You've got so many different people. I mean, diversity is a byword now, but it was really, it's very diverse in its culture even then. Who was a DCI down there at that time?
DCI was Fred Stanard, who was an absolute legend. You'd go to him with a problem and he'd say, Fred, because we did call him Fred, really.
Yeah.
There's a problem. And he'd say, no such thing as problems. There's only solutions. And he was a different sort of DCI, but he was great to work with. The humour, which I think he instilled throughout the division, was absolutely brutal and probably wouldn't survive in today's world. But it was great. He was a West Ham supporter. I was a Tottenham supporter. My Tottenham mug got kidnapped and disappeared for about 2 months, and one day I was upstairs in the canteen making the tea and happened to find it in the back of a cupboard. So having made the tea, I came downstairs with the tray of tea with my empty mug on the tray, and he was in the DC's office where he pretty much lived, and I said, ha, I've found my mug. He just took it off and threw it on the ground and smashed it.
No!
He was, as I say, it was brutal humour. But my God, it was a great place to work.
Could you imagine that now? We'd all get stuck on for bullying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was, you know, and as I say, it was brutal, and he knew you could take it, and it was just a really good laugh. I must just tell you another story, if I can, about the mug. It was probably the replacement mug. And one day I was out of the office. I was sharing the DS's office in those days with Kevin Macy. And I'd gone out of the office. I come back and everybody's laughing. And I look, and my mug is outside the building now on the flat roof, sort of hanging over the edge, about to drop. And the person laughing most is Tony Coniford. And I knew Fred Stanard had put him up to it. I think Fred had probably disappeared somewhere. So Tony was one of my DCs, and I said, "Wait, go and get that mug." So opened the window, he climbed out the window, got the mug, pouring down with rain. And foolishly, he handed me back before he got in the window, back through the window. So the window got shut and Tony got wet for a few minutes. But that was the sort of humour we had. But my goodness, we worked hard, and we got some cracking results in that division.
Yeah, because it's the border, isn't it? You're coming straight out of the East End, straight into Essex, metropolitan Essex, and it is a busy place. I worked down there on a number of different jobs, and yeah, it was a great place to work. How long did you stay at Ockendon?
I did Ockendon for 2 or 3 years, and then because the opportunities to act up as DI started arising, I then went to Grays and did a couple of years in Grays. So in all, I did sort of 5 years, I think it was, as a detective sergeant at Grays Division. And then I still wanted to stay in CID. You know, that was still very much my intention. I loved being a DS. I think it was a very, very enjoyable and important rank. But, you know, I wanted to be a DI. And at that stage, there weren't any likely vacancies coming up. Peter Blythe, who'd been my mentor really since I was a cadet at South End. He was divisional commander, and he asked me whether I'd like to be a uniform inspector at Grays, and I accepted that offer and did that for just under a year before having the opportunity to go and work at C11 at New Scotland Yard.
Wow. Yeah, because I mean, it does help to understand how the uniform roles work, doesn't it? Because it's hard to say to somebody, well, you can't do that or you can do that unless you've actually done some of that groundwork. Definitely,
and I think the biggest learning thing for me going back into uniform, and so it's only for a year as an inspector, was just appreciating how difficult things are in the middle of the night to deal with someone.
Yeah.
It's very, very easy coming in the morning as a DC, DS, DI, whatever, and thinking, my goodness, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? But I think when you go back into uniform and just have that experience, albeit it was a bit of a fleeting glimpse, it did remind me how different people are at 2 o'clock in the morning to how they may be when you see them in the cell at 9 o'clock.
Yeah, absolutely. So what year did you go to C11?
I went to C11 in 1986. And the job then, I mean, it was a brilliant, brilliant job. You were really trying to develop intelligence on criminals living anywhere in North and East London, and then fanning out to Essex, Suffolk, Cambridge, Suffolk and Norfolk.
Right.
So you know, it's a massive area, and you could really choose anybody you like who you're going to do surveillance on. I had a team of 3 sergeants from different forces and 2 DCs. One of those DCs was a motorcyclist. And we would, as I say, start wherever in that region we would then follow the target, get intelligence, and then the idea would be that we would then get the crime squad or robbery squad or whoever to take on that target full time. But often, you know, that we found them committing crimes, and it was a fantastic job. You know, it was lots and lots of overtime. It was lots and lots of work, because you can't do that sort of job in 8 hours.
So on C11, were you there when the officer was killed at Kenny Noy's place?
No, it was just after that, probably 18 months or so after that.
Right.
But we were known as, you know, the 1 and 2 area provincial team.
Right.
And John Ford worked on the 1 and 2 area C11 surveillance team.
Right.
So often there was times, because they trained me in surveillance. So I went up there as an untrained surveillance officer. I had to do the 5-week C11 course, where you didn't even see a car until week 4.
Right.
The first 3 weeks were all on foot. And because of that, they then used us if they needed any sort of additional resources on the 1 and 2 Met team. We would actually join them. So I did know a lot of his colleagues, but never obviously met John Forden.
Terrible time. How long were you on C11?
Well, it was only 2 years, and there was no pressure on me to come back to Essex, but I was aware there was some massive changes taking place in Essex and in the police service generally. So sort of picture the time, 1986 to 1988, Police and Criminal Evidence Act came in.
Yep.
So I'd experienced the pilot, which was in sort of 1985. So I'd, as a uniform inspector, I'd done the review officer's role, learnt more about the custody officer, but never actually did it for real. And wanting to come back as a detective and remain as a detective, I was conscious that, you know, I needed to become comfortable with pace, not something you had any dealings with at all as a surveillance officer on C11. So I was very conscious of that. Also, tape recorded interviews came in.
Yep.
Essex Police introduced Holmes 1. And I think, I'm not even sure which command and control system it was then, whether it was Storm or Iris, but that had been implemented as well. So I knew I needed to get back and become familiar with that. So I let Essex know that I was ready to come back, and I got the very plum posting of being DI at South End, which was absolutely brilliant. And, you know, I was very, very proud to have that role.
Yeah, it was another busy area. Yeah, I mean, 1987, 86, 87, it was Iris, wasn't it? Because we'd had C1s prior to that, where people wrote down the... And the other thing, Steve, and when you came on shift, because I joined in 87, when you came on shift, if the shift before had left any work for you to take on, there would be hell to pay. Those lists were cleared down by the operators, everybody cleared down so the next shift could start afresh. Now they're on a backlog of weeks.
Well, yeah. I mean, we may get into that.
We will get into that.
Things have changed greatly. But yeah, as a uniform inspector on nights, your last job was to go through that ring folder of the yellow C1 messages just to make sure that everything had been
allocated
signed
and dealt
off,
with.
and you weren't leaving anything for the early turn. Going back to my days on Canvey, you know, I know on uniform, the last thing we did was go up and down the high street to make sure there were no windows put in.
Yeah.
You know, our predecessors, I know, and it didn't happen to me, if a burglary had been missed on nights, you'd get called back in.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people I worked with when I joined the job, you know, spoke about those times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that wasn't the case when I was a PC, but goodness me, if there had been a burglary in the high street, you'd certainly know about it when you reported for duty next time.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Absolutely. Now, Southend, it brings its own issues, doesn't it? Because you have such a transient population, certainly with nighttime economy element, but of course it's a holiday destination. And even more so at that time, more people were holidaying in the UK. What types of crimes would you be expected to deal with as the DI for Southend?
Well, I should say, first of all, it's my hometown. So, I was comfortable working there. I knew the area well. I knew a lot of people in Southend, the good and bad. So that helped.
Yeah.
But the sort of, there was... I later worked at Basildon, and I thought Basildon was equally as busy, but the crimes were either very, very serious or the lower level. Southend, if I'm making myself clear, seemed to have more of the middle level sort of crimes.
Yeah.
So, you'd get some very serious house burglaries, you get lots of robberies. You got some quite serious assaults in the nightclubs and that sort of thing. And you tended to get quite a few murders, which then as a DI, you were expected to certainly cover during the first couple of hours before an SIO would attend from headquarters. So there was lots of those sorts of jobs that the DI dealt with. Similarly, a lot of reported rapes came in, and again, that had to be a detective inspector who dealt with it. So, the sorts of crimes I expected to deal with, but it was again good development for me.
But it's voluminous, isn't it? There's so much volume down in Southend when it comes to work. And the other issues, as I say, with the nighttime economy, you'd have a serious assault at one of the nightclubs. That person the victim may have never been to Southend before, and then you have to pin them down. And the suspect is unlikely to have come from Southend. So to try and locate them, because we didn't have the same techniques as we've got today with facial recognition, stuff they're too reliant on. There's no it's the real detective work in order to find people, but it is what it is. Where did you go to from Southend? Did you stay down there?
There was then, I think Peter Blythe had followed me back to Southend or vice versa, and he wanted to set up what we called the divisional support team, which was, I suppose, a sort of a mini sort of divisional crime squad.
Yep.
Did a bit of surveillance. I mean, the only training they had was me training them.
Yeah.
But that was a good little team, and it was based at Rayleigh, covering the division. And he wanted me to go there, run that, and also run Rayleigh Division, which I did. And I'd have preferred to stay at Southend, but that was okay. And then I recall there was some sort of problem at Basildon. Sort of personnel problem, and I then had to go. Somebody got moved, and I had to go to Basildon, which I didn't really want to do at all because I'd never worked at Basildon before. I didn't certainly have the local knowledge that I had at Southend, but I went to Basildon and actually thoroughly enjoyed that, and sort of dealt with some very serious cases there. And there was nothing wrong with working at Basildon. That turned out to be a really good posting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because your divisional support team at that time, and I don't know what it's like down at Southend now, but you had a lot of sex workers in certain parts of Southend, and so their work as a team was quite diverse because a lot of that work has now been pushed into local authorities, engagement, stakeholder work, whereas beforehand it would have all been about the police and what the police enforcement would do. So that's developed, and that is quite a unique thing for Essex because there aren't a whole host of places where sex workers would be operating.
No, that's right. No, so say, a lively place, Southend, but everywhere I ended up working as a DI, I thoroughly enjoyed.
Brilliant. How did your life within the police service progress from that point? You're at Basildon. It's a smaller town, but still equally as busy because you've got all those different types of people there. At what point did you become an SIO?
Well, we're now moving into the sort of 1991, 92, that sort of time span. And the first DCI's posting I had was actually to headquarters, where I was, I guess it was Ralph Barrington who was Detective Chief Superintendent, and I guess the sort of colloquial term is I was his bag man for a few months. It was a lot of sort of project work, and really wasn't my cup of tea at all, but it was a stepping stone to becoming a DCI. I was promoted now to DCI, so it was just about waiting for the right opportunity to crop up and working at headquarters. I suppose I had my fingers on the pulse, and an opportunity came up for DCI at Southend, and I hope I was the obvious choice, and I became DCI at Southend, which I think, looking back, was the proudest moment of my career. To be head of CID of my hometown was really important to me, really special, and I really, really enjoyed that. By the time I'd got to Southend, the DCI's office had moved. They'd moved it down the corridor, so all the command team was sort of next to each other. And I didn't like the office. It meant when they had ID parades that you were locked in your office for an hour and a half or whatever, which, I wasn't comfortable with at all. And anyway, I persuaded Mick Benning to move the DCI's office back to the one I'd sort of visited many years before, and asked Peter Blythe if I could do a cadet attachment to CID. So I went back to that office, and that was rightfully the DCI's office, and I reclaimed it, and very proud I was too.
Well, Mick Benning, one of life's gentlemen, absolute gent, and because when you were on the fourth floor, you would have had Ralph. Peter Went. Was Peter Went one of the detective superintendents?
Yeah, it changed so much. Peter Went was certainly there. I think Mike Gamble was there. Dave Bright was there, and I think Brian Story. Probably at that time. Although no, hang on, that's probably I'm probably too far on. I think Brian wouldn't have been there, and I'm not sure Dave Bright was either. Actually, I think I'm going back to when I became a superintendent. So yeah, you definitely Peter Went. I think John Garrard had gone by then. Yeah, Mike Ainsley. Can't actually remember who else was there at that particular time, but real characters, life's characters. Definitely. My divisional commander around that time was Alan Gilling. Yeah,
and there was some, as I say, very interesting folk. So you're the DCI at Southend. How did that work with you? Because you knew everybody there. Not only did you know the local public, the local population, but you also knew a lot of the detectives that were working with you, and because you'd grown up with them. How did that work with you? And what was, did you face any issues working with people that you knew so well?
I don't think so. It's probably better to ask them if you were able to. But I think I got on with everybody. There was some real characters. Look at the DS's office, and to begin with, there was people like Roy Clark who was a DS. I'm not sure probably when I was a DI, there was Dave Ashworth. He'd probably retired by the time I was DCI. But there was certainly people like Ken Wright, who had been a DC for a long while, and had been, I'd worked at Rayleigh with him. He was certainly there when I was a DI. So there were lots of experienced detectives still there, and equally sort of others who I knew who were coming through the ranks as a detective. So yeah, but I think knowing most people, that's an opportunity rather than a threat, and it's it's a place I really, really enjoyed working, and I think everybody in the team, enjoyed being at Southend. Not saying it's anything to do with me. I think it was mainly just the environment at that time was a really nice workplace to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And because you ran some interesting jobs, I vividly remember you ran a TP UC type job where there was almost a cash converters type situation where people took in stolen goods. We worked on, came down to support that. And the other major crime bits that you dealt with, didn't you go to the Philippines whilst you were down there?
Yeah, I did. With Fred Simpkins. Yeah, there was a missing woman. So China Rose Sims, she went missing in Southend. And when we started investigating her disappearance, we learned that there was a background of domestic violence, and she had told her sister that she was thinking of leaving her husband, David Sims. The two of them went missing, and then when we started looking deeper into this, we found out that David Sims had set up a bank account in a moody name, in the name of Anthony Lewis.
Right.
And they had a lodger at the time, a guy called Jeffrey Paston. And what had happened some months after they'd gone missing, that he had actually sold the property they were living in Southend using the name Anthony Lewis.
Right.
And again, it was established that he had used that name to buy the property.
Oh.
So it was all very, very mysterious. And inquiries failed to locate either of them. But then Paston was located in the Philippines. So Fred Simpkins and I went to the Philippines to interview him. And really, it didn't take the job any further, but an interesting experience nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. And did we ever find the bodies of the individuals?
No, still missing.
Wow.
Every time I've had any contact with any television company over the last 5 years or so, I've tried to sort of interest them in the job.
Yeah.
Because I still think it's eminently detectable. Two people don't just disappear off the face of the earth.
No.
It's not something that Essex Police now, sort of look at. We treated it as a murder, but it wasn't a murder. I mean, it's still two missing people.
Yeah.
I still think with a little bit of work, some sort of answer could still be found.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that is an interesting one. When we first met on a case in Colchester, didn't we? I mean, I'd met you before that, but I was on the inquiry team on a alleged sex attack, which didn't bear fruit, or wasn't actually a sex attack. It'd all been contrived. But during that time, we then got on to another inquiry, which the guy was subsequently found not guilty, which meant that we went as a collective to the BBC for Crime Watch.
Yeah.
And that's where you first met Jill Dando. I mean, I'll put some context around that. The producer at the time was a lady called Rookie Sidwar, who was a girl that I sat next to at school. And so it was quite an easy win, wasn't it? We went up there, we put it on there, identified the suspect, took him to court, but he, as I say, he got found not guilty. But you had lots to do with Jill Dando post the attendance of Crime Watch, and obviously did a lot of work with her up until her untimely death.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was a bit cheeky of me, really, but as you remember when we were at Crime Watch, I think there was some social sort of event immediately afterwards, which we went to at BBC Television Centre.
Yep.
And I got talking to Jill Dando, and she told me that she was due to do some work for Essex Police, I think for the Child Protection Unit, 2 or 3 weeks later, I think sometime in January the following year. And she was still waiting to find out transport arrangements and who was going to collect her. And I think Dick Madden was in charge of child protection at that stage. And I can't remember if I was detective chief superintendent or superintendent. But anyway, when I got back and spoke to Dick, I said, I'll tell you who's going to pick her up. I'll go and pick her up. So on the morning of when she was going to do this filming for child protection, I drove to Fulham, picked her up, drove her back to, I think she had to go to school in Brittle or somewhere like that.
Right.
I dropped her off there, hung around as she did her filming. Then she had to do a voiceover at our television unit, and I took her back there. And then she said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll get a train back." And I said, no problem. I'll take you back. So I took her back to a house in Gowan Avenue. She had a cup of tea. She gave me a piece of cake. I think my car got a ticket outside her address, which she sorted out because she was about to do some work with the local authority. But what was interesting was that I'd done a couple of courses where I'd seen the 6 o'clock news go out live, which was an absolute fantastic experience for somebody to watch. And I was keen for my kids to have the same experience. So she was trying to arrange for me to take them up to watch her read the news on, a convenient occasion. And she was doing the news less and less then, so it was difficult to find a convenient date. But we were still trying to find that date when sadly she was murdered. So it was, as I say, she was a lovely, lovely person, and sort of told me a lot about her life. She was very excited. She was soon to get married. And it was, an absolute tragedy when she was murdered.
The irony of that particular case was that on the day that we went to arrest the suspect for the job that we'd put on the television, we were driving down the M11. I was with Keith Davis and we were going to Romford to nick the guy when the news came on that she'd been murdered.
Yeah.
That was the very day. And I've subsequently played golf with her, who she was he was her fiancé, but I played golf with him last year, actually. Really, really nice chap. But yeah, I mean, we do get to meet some very interesting people. We've done some very interesting things. You've just highlighted 2 of them. When you are coming to the conclusion, you're an SIO, you've worked on some fantastic jobs, interesting murders, the whole thing. I mean, what was the standout for you with Essex Police?
Or in terms of jobs?
Yeah.
I think there's 2 really. One was the very first murder I dealt with as a detective superintendent. I had dealt with a couple of others as a DCI where I had sort of persuaded headquarters, look, this is, we've got the person responsible, we've got the evidence, it would be good experience if I can deal with it. And on those occasions I was allowed to. But the very first one as a fully fledged detective superintendent SIO was a murder at Harlow, which was, again, the first day of my turning up at headquarters as an SIO. And there'd been this feud between 2 leaders of the Combat 18 organisation. And the two leaders had fallen out. One of them was a guy called Charlie Sargent, and the other guy called Browning, wanted to get some property back from Sargent. So they agreed on a sort of like an intermediary to go and pick up. I think it was some plastering tools, something as innocuous as that, and a list of C18 members, Combat 18 members. And when this guy, Christopher Cross, turned up at the mobile home where Sargent lived in Harlow, there was another guy, a guy called Cross, who was with Sargent, and Cross stabbed this intermediary, Chris Castle, and killed him there and then. And it was a way of getting back at Browning. Now, Sargent didn't actually lay a hand on the deceased, and Browning was sort of in the background and didn't see anything that went on. But through some very, very good detective work with a team who I didn't know at all. I mean, Harlow wasn't a place I'd worked before. It was, majority of the inquiry team were Harlow officers who I didn't know. But I had Simon Coxall as my deputy, who I knew well. And just through really old-fashioned detective work, speaking to people, the sort of hypothesis developed, and we were able to prove that and convict Sargent and Cross of the murder. And I think, that probably wasn't one of the most famous murders in Essex, although perhaps, given the background of C18, it could have been. But nonetheless, it was very, very, very satisfying to clear that up and get the result. And as I say, Sargent was found guilty of murder due to the joint enterprise. But we accepted, he didn't lay a glove on the deceased. So that was very, very satisfying. I think the other one, which you worked on as well, has got to be Danielle Jones. And the thing with that, by that time I was the detective chief superintendent. I wasn't the original SIO. Peter Coltman was. It was Peter and all the team that got the evidence sufficient to charge him. But then, unfortunately, Peter went off sick for several months and somebody needed to take it over. And all the other SIOs had their own caseloads. I didn't. And so chief officers appointed me as the SIO. That said, there was still loads and loads of work to do. It was a no-body murder. There was 800 and something odd sightings of Danielle around the country, in fact, around the world, which needed to be bottomed out because only one of them could have been her. I know it was highly, highly unlikely, but that's all the defence had to say is, hey, you didn't investigate that sighting. How can you say that my client is responsible for murder? So, that was an important case without any shadow of doubt.
Absolutely. And there's such a dignified family. I know you and I have had contact with them in the past couple of years, and they work tirelessly in order to keep this in the public domain because the body of their daughter has never been found. I mean, and that is absolutely terrible. And the pieces that we've done together have gone far and wide, and they're still being shown on the television today, and long may it continue until they get some resolution around it.
Yeah.
How did you feel? You're now you've come to the conclusion of your service. You are a copper, through and through. Steve Reynolds is that archetypical, cut him in half, he's got police written all the way through him. That's what he is, a stick of rock. How did you feel when you said, right, that's it, I'm going now, there's my warrant card, I'm off?
It was difficult, but I think it wasn't sort of sudden. If I look at what happened in the next 18 years after sort of retiring, it was a gradual sort of step away from law enforcement. I think, you know, when I retired, it was, the official date was about 3 days after my 50th birthday. And I still loved every minute of it. But I'd got remarried. The sort of lump sum was attractive. So it was about, could I have access to that, but at the same time stay in law enforcement? And that's why I went to work for the IPCC.
How easy was that for a transition? Because I mean, we've spoken offline around this, but nobody likes a bent copper, do they? Let's face it. We it's hard enough as it is to fight criminals, but if you've got corrupt police officers working against you, that makes it really, really difficult. But how was that transition from working within the police to the IPCC?
Yeah, at that time, the investigators in the IPCC, there were a lot of former police officers. So the environment was similar, not identical by any means, but there were some similarities between working in the CID as an investigator and working at the IPCC. I think the police service was understandably sensitive about the IPCC. When I joined, they'd been running about 16, 17 months, and the service was settling down and trying to, you know, understand, comprehend what the IPCC were all about. But I think as a sort of former senior police officer, it actually helped. I think it helped shape the IPCC, and I think it also provided some reassurance to officers who were investigated by the IPCC.
Yes.
I think myself and my former police colleagues were able to identify when an honest mistake had been made, notwithstanding the consequences, compared with somebody who was just an out-and-out bad officer.
Yeah.
And I think generally when you are dealing with the police service, when you're investigating the police service, you know, sort of witnesses, police witnesses, actually have the same thoughts as well.
Yeah.
They don't want to be working with bad people. So I think my background sort of helped no end during those, you know, first few years at the IPCC, and I really didn't see it as any problem. I saw it as an advantage. But you know, the organisation, the IPCC, changed, and certainly by the time I left, it had become very different.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually worked on the first managed investigation with the IPCC, a death in custody. I went up there as the OM, and I worked up there. What year was that? That would have been about 2006 when they first started.
No, I think, is that Kepper Joe?
Yeah.
Well, that was in 2005.
2005, right? Okay.
Just before Stockwell, just before the time I went up there,
right?
Because I went to visit you.
You did.
I think Deirdre may have been there as well.
Yeah.
And I took that as an opportunity to have a little nose around the IPCC and see if it was actually what I'd want to do.
Yeah.
And I made some contacts on that day.
Yeah. Nick Hardwick.
Which I still got.
Nick Hardwick was there. Was it Nick Hardwick? Nick.
Yeah, Nick Hardwick's the.
Yeah,
he was the chair.
He was the chair. Yeah. So you've arrived there. Essex Police have patted you on the back. They've put money in your bank account because you're retired and you've had your leaving due. You arrived there, and what was your first job when you go?
Well, what actually happened, just to correct you slightly, was that I went through a selection process for a senior investigator's job.
Right.
Everything seemed to be teed up, you know, and I spoke to a lot of people, and there was an assessment centre, and cut a long story short, I came second on that assessment centre.
Right.
And there was only one vacancy.
Oh.
So Somebody else got the SI's post and were due to start in September of 2005. They then offered me a DSI, a Deputy Senior Investigator's post, and told me that there was going to be another vacancy for Senior Investigator in the foreseeable future. So I agreed to accept that position, and the plan was, this would have been sort of July time, probably around about 7/7. So I think it was probably 2 or 3 days after 7/7 that I agreed to do this deputy's post starting in September. So I was planning to take a lot of leave, go on a nice holiday, and then make the transition to the IPCC on the 1st of September. On the 22nd of July, John Charles de Menezes was shot dead by the police. That was on the Friday. And on the Monday, I was doing a covert job where we were based at Stansted Airport. And I was in my office there, and I got a phone call from the Deputy Chief Constable, Charlie Clark, and he said, basically, the IPCC want you to work on Stockwell. We're happy to release you. Are you happy to be seconded until the 31st of August? So that's how I actually went to the IPCC early, and I was on that job for the next 18 months, really.
Wow. I mean, you've written this brilliant book. The Met on Trial, and I'm not going to go into every single part of it, because obviously what we want is people to have the opportunity to buy this book, which is available through Amazon. But I mean, I've read it and it's absolutely captivating. But the foreword actually says, and you'll have to forgive me if I don't quote verbatim, but it says that this is dedicated to Jean-Charles de Menezes and to the officers who genuinely believed that there was a threat. That's it in a nutshell, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, you know, which is quite an indicative part of the book. I think people need to read that first, because then they can make their minds up as they go through it. But it was a very emotive subject and a very difficult one to become involved in, because obviously tensions were very high in the UK at the time around terrorism. We'd gone through 7/7. This is taking place on the 22nd. What was that like, walking into the office of the IPCC at that time in order to undertake this role?
Well, I mean, they were under pressure. There's no doubt about it. This is the fledgling IPCC who are dealing suddenly with the most high-profile, controversial police shooting there ever has been or is ever likely to be. They knew they were going to be under incredible scrutiny from politicians, from the police service, from the media, from the public, and they needed to get it right. I think the first thing is I was very welcomed. I'm not saying, you know, I was the cavalry at all, but there was a lot of experience already at the IPCC, but there was probably nobody with the experience of major investigations that I had. So I was welcomed with open arms, and joined a team which had been developed by my good friend John Cummins, who was the senior investigator. There were some cracking young people on that team. I asked many of them, why on earth didn't you become a police officer? And they would say things like, I just wanted to be an investigator. I didn't fancy the confrontation of patrol work. Valid comments like that.
Yeah.
But they were super people, very, very good investigators, albeit with little experience at that time. But there's 2 or 3 of those who are pretty much, well, I wouldn't say they'd just come out of university, but they were very young in their working lives.
Yeah.
And they have now got senior roles in non-police law enforcement agencies. So it was a cracking team to work with, I found the transition very, very easy, but it was helped by being involved in such a enormous, high-profile job.
And there was nothing that you couldn't ask for, is there? I mean, at the end of the day, there are so many barriers to policing. You can't do this, you can't do that. But I would imagine on a job of that magnitude, there's nothing that you can't ask for that you wouldn't get. From security support right the way through to, we want house to house done in every street in southeast London. You'd get everything that you needed.
Yeah, I mean, as I say in the book, something that was apparent is that, we know the traditional way of conducting an investigation.
Yeah.
You interview a witness, you take a statement, and they sign that statement, and during that exercise, you can question them and ask them things to clarify points. However, again, from our experience, if a police officer's a witness, they tend to make their own statement, where you don't have that interaction. And a lot of the process of that investigation was sending a email to a single point of contact, say somebody on CO19, and really saying, we would like a statement from this officer covering these points. And then several weeks later, we get that statement back, and not all those points have been covered. So it then goes backwards and forwards. The added dynamic was that the Metropolitan Police, quite understandably, set up their own group called Operation Irene, which was the July review group, which was reviewing everything that happened in London during July 2005.
Right.
So without doubt, they were monitoring what evidence was coming our way. Now, I'm not saying there's anything iffy about that, but it was happening. So we didn't have the control and independence that one might expect.
Yeah.
Having said that, we were still able to conduct a thorough investigation, which stood the scrutiny of the European Court several years later, when they concluded that it had been an independent and thorough investigation. But it was different because of that dynamic I've just described.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that recognition from the European Court is quite satisfying, isn't it? That you've done an impartial investigation which served everybody. Absolutely everybody.
The family to this day still don't think justice has been served, and I can understand that. But, to get that independent sort of scrutiny from the Grand Chamber of the European Court was very satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we are getting close to the end of this interview, Steve, but how do you feel about British policing now? I mean, I've got my views. I get very disappointed. A friend of mine who you mentioned earlier, he had a witness, or a lady round at his house, and they were doing some work and there was some screaming in the park. This is only 6 weeks ago. And she witnessed the stabbing. And to date, nobody's taken a statement from her. And it's these types of things that let the bobbies down, let the system down, and then the public turn to social media in order to, there's no point in reporting that because. But how do you feel about British policing now?
Well, I mentioned just now about my colleagues at the IPCC and how good of detectives in the police service they would have been. And I think, the demise of the CID today particularly saddens me. They have problems recruiting detectives. They're now, ironically, fast-tracking recruits into CID because other officers don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
And I find that very, very sad and quite ironic, given what I said about those IPCC colleagues. I think there is a problem with trying to make the police service very family friendly, which I just don't think fits in. And I think the cost of that ethos is that there's now no ownership of problems. So let me give you a scenario. When I was a DI, say at Southend or Basildon, that makes no odds really, I would do a day's work, sometimes go home for tea and then come back in the evening and do another couple of hours. But if it was one of those evenings where I was at home watching the television and something happened, I would get called out to go back in. And I wouldn't mind that at all. In fact, to the contrary, if I hadn't been called in, I'd have gone ballistic. I'd have said, why wasn't I called in?
Yeah.
I should be. This is my area. I own this area. I want to influence the investigation. Nowadays, I understand that DIs work shift work.
Yeah.
Because what I've just quoted to you isn't family friendly. So, for example, a DI working at Grays will work shift work, and when they may do a late term, and then after 5 o'clock, they're responsible for Brentwood, Harlow, and Loughton. So, if anything happens in those areas, they've got to oversee it until the DI in that area comes on duty.
Yeah.
So I think half their time is spent being briefed and debriefing. Nobody takes ownership. And I think that's where the problem lies. You know, when we were DSs, if there was a spate of burglaries, each burglary hurt you.
Yeah.
You would come up with plainclothes patrols or whatever to try and catch the person. Now they don't care about the detection rate. It's all about reported crime, which I've also got a theory on. I mean, recently you said you've had some contact. I've had some contact with the police. There was a problem at my golf club and a crime was reported. And a couple of days later, I got some information about it. Now, I can't go into the detail, obviously. But the first thing I did was I thought, right, I'm going to get a visit from the police today. So let's take the dogs out for a walk now.
Yeah.
And then I'm free for the rest of the day to deal with whoever. Did that, come home, rang 101. Well, it took me the whole day and into the next morning to speak to somebody who was able to record what I wanted to tell them. I never, ever, ever had a visit from the police to actually delve in deeper to the background. I ended up writing it all down and sending it to them because I wanted to be assured that they got it, and because there was actually some time critical elements. A response officer was allocated the crime. In my opinion, it should have been a detective. That response officer, through no fault of his own, was never there. I could never get in touch with him. He was doing shift work. He was on this sort of leave or that sort of leave. He was on study leave. He was on this course and that course. And at the end of the day, half the job was done.
Yeah.
And that half of the job was what I'd given them. If they'd have investigated it thoroughly, they would have got other people as well involved. But there was just, as I say, no ownership. And I was very, very frustrated. And I did speak to a senior officer about it, but really they didn't get what I was saying.
No.
And it was so sad. And as I say, they now talk about reported crime decreasing. Well, I'm not surprised, because who bothers to report minor crime? It's so difficult to get through to them, and then you know that nothing's going to be done. And that's not individuals' fault. It's the system. I don't know where it's gone wrong, but it's very, very, very sad. And the worst thing that can ever happen to me these days is where somebody I play golf with has had recent contact with the police.
Yeah.
Because I'm so embarrassed by the stories that I hear.
Yeah, and I am even now, I've been retired 8 years, you've been out 18. Even now, I still feel that I'm part of that family and I know what I would be doing. I have to accept that the types of crimes that they deal with compared to the types of crimes that we picked up are completely different. You know, you talked about Holmes 1. Well, most people didn't have a computer when Holmes 1 came in. So that's a different... But we've got a police and crime commissioner who doesn't recognise the fact that the world has changed. And, I mean, they're making people redundant at the moment, Steve. They're making people redundant because they've been given a pay rise, but they've got to find the money from somewhere, so they're going to make people redundant. Well, that's only going to go one way, isn't it? It's going to end up in a worse system. But anyway, Steve, why did you, you know, we've talked about the policing side, and why did you write the book? What was the inspiration to write the book? Because it is brilliant. It's something that should be in every police officer's desk. Every ex-police officer should be reading this because it is a very detailed account of what went on at that particular time. But what was your inspiration to write that book?
Well, there were two reasons why I wrote the book. The first one was, as you know, I've been involved with some production companies doing documentaries regarding Danielle Jones. One of those companies was very interested in doing a documentary about the IPCC investigation into the shooting. Unbeknown to them, unfortunately, Netflix, Sky, BBC and Channel 4 also had productions already underway regarding 7/7 and July 2005. When the company then did their pitch to try and get a documentary commissioned, they were unsuccessful because it was felt that this area had already been covered.
Right.
Now, around about December 2023, I was invited to advise on a drama production, which is actually being released on the 30th of this month, 30th of April, which is going to be on Disney Plus. And I actually was asked for 3 days to be an advisor on the inquest scenes regarding that production. Because that production is all about 7/7, 21/7 and the shooting of John Charles de Menezes. It's actually called Suspect, the shooting of John Charles de Menezes. So when I was working on that, I learned more about these other documentaries. And I then got in touch with the producers of these other 4 documentaries, and because it was clear that the other company weren't going to be successful, and they released me from their agreement. And I spoke to them, and all of them were so interested in covering the IPCC investigation, but basically said, we just haven't got room to do it justice. And it actually turns out that there's more about the investigation in the drama than there is in the documentaries.
Right.
So the BBC director, a guy called Jim Nally, I actually did some filming for them, which in the end they didn't have room for in their fantastic program, The London Bombings. But he said, why don't you write a book? And he'd done some work, you know, he'd written some books before, and he helped me with certainly turning the first draft into the second draft. He was an enormous help. So that was the first reason why I did it, because, as I say, I felt the documentaries had a big gap in them. The second thing is just setting the record straight. I was playing golf with a guy 18 months ago, and we were talking about what I dealt with in the past, and we spoke about de Menezes. And he said, what I don't understand is why that Brazilian ran away from the police and jumped over the barriers. And I said, that just didn't happen. That is just folklore, which, as a result of a Sky 24/7 newsreel, a witness said that early on, mistaking John Charles de Menezes for actually a firearms officer 2 minutes later coming through those barriers. Right. And I just thought the record needed to be made straight. And that's why I did it. you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast about published author. I certainly don't see myself as that. You know, I've written one book, which I'm lucky enough to have got published, and I am proud of it. But, yeah. Call me an ex-cop, but I don't see myself as an author. I really don't.
Well, do you know what I do, mate? And the fact is that you've got it out there, because everyone says there's a book in everyone, but you've actually done it. All right. This is fantastic. And as I say, people need to get hold of a copy of this, because it is really, really good and it's captivating. And I hope that somebody does works with you to do a drama just on, this is a story on its own. I think that is lost. The massive jigsaw puzzle of 7/7 and everything else that went on, I get that, but this is one story on its own, which is absolutely captivating.
Yeah.
Steve, before we conclude this interview, I'm going to ask you, have you got anything you'd like to add, alter or correct in relation to what you've said today, sir?
No, not at all. As I say, we reminisced a bit, and I hope that's not too didn't go on and on. No, it was an enjoyable experience. Thank you for inviting me, and I wish you the very best. My absolute pleasure, mate. I look forward to seeing you soon. We'll have to catch up over a cup of coffee somewhere, and we'll chat some more. Have a great day, and I will speak to you very soon. Thanks, Steve. All right.
God bless you, mate.
Cheers,
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of X-Job Downloaded. Please like, follow and share. Your support is invaluable. Thank you.